begin the recording. And I'm going to hand it over to Pearl, who's going to present to us something really important that we should all be aware of. So take it away, Pearl.
All right, Gila, thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me back. It's nice to see some familiar faces and names from the last time I spoke to the shul, so I'm glad that you're back. For anyone who wasn't here last time, that's okay too. They're not really connected, the presentation, so you should be able to follow. I'm going to start sharing my screen with you. Okay, so we are going to be talking, as Gila said, all about the disputed territories, sometimes referred to as the occupied territories as well. We'll be discussing the terminology, some legal issues, some historical issues, as well as the current situation as it stands today, and where we can kind of look towards the future. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or if you want to wait until the end, we can kind of open it up more conversation style. So just a quick intro, I think we can skip that. Okay, so before we really look at the issues that we need to know about, it's important to kind of have an understanding of the history of the region. Just, not super in depth, but just to kind of go over it briefly. So going back more than 2,000 years ago, we had an independent Jewish kingdom in this colorful part of the map over here. So pretty much the map of Israel, although there are some, you can see the border of the current map of Israel, there are some differences, but essentially there was an independent Jewish kingdom in most of what we know today to be Israel. It was a Jewish kingdom that was independent. Eventually it splits into the northern kingdom of Israel, Yisrael, and the southern kingdom of Judea or Yehuda. Eventually, the kingdoms are conquered by outside empire. So the north is conquered by Assyria, the south is conquered by the Babylonians, and that leads us into exile, the Jewish people into exile. At different periods, we were able to return or and rebuild, and at other times there were very few Jews present in the land. And it changes hands many, many times over the next 2,000 years or so, when the Roman Empire took control and exiled all of the Jews for the second time, which led to the diaspora that we live in today. That was just after, around the year 0, just after. When they took over the land, they renamed it, and they renamed it Palestine, as might sound familiar today. And that name basically stuck. So it became known as Palestine, Palestina. It was a province initially of the Roman Empire. And then as the land changed hands many different times, the name just kind of stuck. Whichever empire took control afterwards kept it that way. And the name was basically changed in order to erase the Jewish connection to the land of Israel. Before it had been called Judea, basically Jewish, and Israel after one of our forefathers. Eventually, at the end of World War I, the British Mandate begins. So the British take control of the region, and they do this in the fulfillment of what was known as the Balfour Declaration. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but essentially it was a declaration by the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Balfour, in 1917, so during World War I, where he expresses favor on behalf of the British government for the creation of a Jewish national home in what was called Palestine, that province of Palestine. And in 1920, this becomes official, legally binding by the League of Nations. The British Mandate begins. As you can see, here's a quote. You can find the whole thing online, but here's a quote. It says, "The mandatory," so the British control, "should be responsible for putting into effect the declaration originally made on November 2nd, 1917, so that was the Balfour Declaration, in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people." So they're officially making this commitment to establish a home for the Jewish people. and they recognize the historical connection of the Jewish people to the land and the grounds for reconstituting their national home. So what they're saying here is they understand that we have an ancient historical connection and that we should be able to reconstitute our national home. So they're acknowledging that we did at one point have a national home in the land, and we are now reconstituting it. The British mandate initially was going to include the pink area that it's called Transjordan at the time, now Jordan, as well as the blue part. However, due to Arab protests in the region, it was decided to be partitioned, and the pink part was given over to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and another independent state was created there alongside the blue, which was supposed to become the state of Israel, the Jewish state. However, that the British mandate led to a period of a lot of fighting and protesting. The local Arab population did not want a Jewish state anywhere in the region. They wanted to have it be an Arab Muslim state. And there was a lot of fighting going on against the local Arab population, the Jewish population, as well as the British, who were still there as part of the mandate. So eventually the British decides that it's basically just not worth it for them to be there anymore. It's causing lots of problems for them. So they basically give control over to the United Nations. So this is about almost 20 years after the British mandate begins. They tell the United Nations, you figure out what to do. These people can't figure out what to do with the land. So, you deal with it. You figure out what to do here. The United Nations votes on this partition plan, where basically the idea is that the blue areas will be a Jewish state, will become a Jewish state, while the pink areas will become an Arab state. And the area around Jerusalem will be an internationally governed body, but right in the center of the Arab state. It would be under international control. Once again, the local Arab population did not accept this plan. The Jews did accept it, and it led to an increase in the fighting that was going on, and really it started what became known as Israel's War of Independence. It started before Israel actually declared independence, because the fighting really escalated at this point in an attempt to try and push the Jews out of the region. So in the middle of May 1948, Israel declares independence. And the next day, the War of Independence officially begins. It had started earlier on, but this is really when Israel's kind of officially brought into war. On the day after Israel declares independence, it's attacked by basically all of its neighboring Arab armies, with the help of some of the Arabs in Israel, not all of them. And while Israel does manage to remain in existence, Israel wins the war. The map looks a little bit different after the war ends. So when Israel declared independence, they were declaring independence in this blue area that had been allotted to them by the United Nations, according to the partition plan. But by the end of the war, the borders look different. They look like this. Everything that's blue is under Israeli control. Everything that is pink with these stripes over here comes under Jordanian control. And the green, the Gaza Strip over here, comes under Egyptian control. These are armistice lines. So this is where the fighting basically stopped. These were never meant to be, the new borders of the country. They were just temporary armistice lines, but they did end up lasting for almost another 20 years. As you can see over here, Jordan takes control over East Jerusalem, which includes the Old City. Jewish people are not allowed to access the Kotel, the Western Wall, many of our holiest sites. Many of them are destroyed or, ransacked while the Jordanians are in control. But we did win the war and managed to remain in existence. We can see over here the goal of the war. This will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre. So there were many, Israel lost 1% of its population in this war, but thank God it was not a war of extermination. But basically after that, the Arab world was sort of building themselves up to be able to sort of go back and kind of fix what had happened in 1948. It was kind of a big embarrassment, you know, the entire Arab world against this tiny one-day-old Jewish country made up with, you know, with a large proportion of its soldiers were Holocaust survivors. And yet they won the war. So the Arab world had sort of been planning its comeback. And in the early 1960s, there was increasing tension with Israel's Arab neighbors, increased terror attacks inside of Israel, troops coming towards the border outside of Israel. The United Nations, after the War of Independence, had placed peacekeeping forces in the Sinai Desert over here to avoid another flare-up between Israel and Egypt. Egypt orders them to leave, and they comply. So that's one of the things that kind of leads up to the war officially starting. Egypt then begins mobilizing its troops towards the border with Israel, as did some of its other neighboring countries, because they had pact with Egypt. Egypt also at the time is making declarations like the one down here. Our basic objective will be the destruction of Israel. President of Iraq saying our goal is clear to wipe Israel off the map. So these are the kinds of statements coming out of the Arab leadership at the time. Some of you may remember this. And this was another indication to Israel that war was imminent. As well, something that's very significant, as we will see shortly, is that Egypt, you can see Egypt and Israel kind of share this, the Gulf of Eilat borders both of them, or it connects to both of them. And one of Israel's main ports is in Eilat down here. And in May, so about a month before the official war starts, Egypt blocks Israel's access to this port, or from the port to international waterways. So they don't allow any Israeli ships out into the international waters. They don't allow any ships coming into Israel to enter. And this is an attempt at kind of economic warfare, because this is one of Israel's most important ports. And actually, according to international law, blocking another country's access to international waterways is an official act of war. So technically that is a way to begin a war with another country, even though there's no like actual fighting kind of on a battlefield. That is a way to start a war if you block another country's access to international waterways. So as a result of all of these different factors, you know, Egypt blocking access to the waterway, Egypt getting the UN forces to leave the Sinai Desert, Egyptian forces and other forces amassing along its border, and the kinds of statements that we're seeing on this slide coming out of the Arab world, Israel knew that war was imminent. And so they launched a preemptive strike against Egypt. They wiped out Egypt's entire air force, basically before Egypt could even realize what was going on. There's a very good video on YouTube. It's called 6 Days of Miracles. It's a video from Mizrahi, and they basically go through all of the different things that had to happen for Israel to succeed in day one of this war. But that really was the starting point when Israel wiped out Egypt's army, or Egypt's air force, sorry. And Israel asked Jordan not to get involved in the war, but they had signed a military pact with Egypt, so they get involved in the war as well. And in only 6 days, Israel manages to more than double, almost triple its size. So again, Israel wins this war very miraculously in 6 days. They gain the entire Sinai Desert from Egypt, as well as the Gaza Strip. They gain the Golan Heights up here from Syria, and they gain the Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, over here from Jordan. The West Bank is the name that Jordan gave to this area when they when they took it over, because it's on the west bank of the Jordan River. But we'll talk about that shortly. So for the first time in almost 20 years, in 19 years, Jewish people could access the Kotel, we could access Hebron, Har HaZeitim. Most of our holy sites had been out of reach for the past 19 years, and now Jerusalem is reunified, and we gain control over all of this territory. These new ceasefire lines gave Israel much more security. They were much easier to defend, right? This region over here is very mountainous, as well as the Golan Heights, and it allowed Israel to have a much better security situation. Same thing with the Sinai Desert. It's a good kind of buffer between Israel and Egypt. But there was some ambiguity over whether Israel had the right to maintain control over these territories. The concept in international law and the laws of war, basically where a country that attacks another country, so a country who's on the offensive side of a war, is not allowed to expand their borders as a result of that conflict. So this was in an attempt to stop imperialism. So basically, if a country, countries shouldn't go to war with one another in order to take territory from one another. And so that's if you're on the offensive side of the war. If you're on the defensive side of the war, then it depends. If you need to retain the territory in order to improve your security situation, then you can do so, because if you would be made to give it back, then there's nothing to kind of stop your neighboring country from just going to war with you again. So in this situation, Israel was on the defensive side. Even though they did launch that preemptive strike, Egypt had officially started the war with them when they blocked access to the waterway. That's why that's significant. And so Israel was on the defensive side of the war, and these new ceasefire lines definitely improved Israel's security situation. But there's a little bit of ambiguity, like, do they need to keep the entire thing in order to maintain their security? And they did launch the first preemptive kind of military strike. So there was a little bit of ambiguity as to whether Israel actually had the right to retain control of these territories. One thing that you might be thinking is that in the War of Independence, Jordan and Egypt both attacked Israel and then gained control as a result of their attack. So we'll discuss that as well shortly, what the kind of status was of those areas. But a couple of weeks after the war ends and the ceasefire lines are drawn, Israel contacts the United States and tells them that they would be willing to negotiate agreements with Egypt and with Syria, where they had gained land, about returning the land that they had gained in exchange for peace agreements. Because even if they're allowed to keep the land as a result of needing the land to maintain peace, Israel would prefer to have a peace agreement with those countries. So they were willing to do that, but they did not hear back from Egypt or from Syria. So just to zoom in a little bit, what areas are we really talking about with the disputed territory? So we have the Gaza Strip down here in Israel's southwest, and we have the West Bank or Judea and Samaria on the kind of central eastern part of Israel. So that's really what we're talking about when we discuss the disputed territories. So now the question becomes, what's with all the different terminology? There's so many different terms that people use to discuss these areas, even in the media, in academia, in conversations. It can be confusing. So I think it's important to sort of look at the different terms that people use and understand, are they accurate? Are they inaccurate? What does it mean when we use these terms? So the first kind of pair, I guess, is the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. Both refer to the area that Jordan occupied during the War of Independence and Israel took control of in the Six-Day War in 1967. And in Israel, they kind of mean different things if you're talking to Israelis or if you're in Israel or if you're in North America or kind of outside of Israel. So in Israel, the term West Bank would what most people use would be Judea and Samaria or Yehuda v'Shamron. That's like just what people refer to the land as. If you were to call it the West Bank, that would sort of signify you as like a more left-wing person. I think that's just because the region's been called Yehuda v'Shamron for thousands of years. And only when the Jordanians took control of it did they call it the West Bank. It doesn't even really make sense from an Israeli perspective. It's on the east side of Israel, which definitely used to confuse me when I was younger. But so for Israelis, it's Judea and Samaria. That's what it is. Like, just because the Jordanians called it the West Bank for 19 years doesn't really affect things. However, outside of Israel, in the diaspora, the more commonly used phrase is the West Bank. That's just kind of what people refer to it as, what people know of it as. It probably wasn't really a region that was on anyone's consciousness until Jordan took control of it, and then and then Israel took it back. So that's sort of what people refer to it as here. If you were to use the term Judea and Samaria, it would sort of signify a more right-leaning perspective. I use them kind of interchangeably, or I try to use both at the same time, not to like pick a side, but also just so people kind of know what I'm referring to. But so neither one is sort of correct or incorrect. They both are correct. It's just important to kind of realize what people might think if you use one versus the other. The next question is the territory. Gila mentioned at the beginning, a lot of people refer to it as the occupied territories. We're referring to it as the disputed territories. So what's the difference? Why this one I do pick a side, I picked disputed, and why is that? So according to the Hague Convention, an occupation is when one sovereign nation takes over the territory of another sovereign nation. So if we think about what Israel did when they took control of the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, Israel was a sovereign nation, but they took control from Jordan. Now, Jordan never actually had the right to have control over that region because, as we mentioned previously, if a country attacks another country and then expands their borders as a result of that conflict, they're not allowed to keep the territory. And that's exactly what happened in the War of 1948. Jordan was on the offensive side of the war. They attacked Israel along with several other Arab countries. And at the end of the war, they had expanded their borders. They had gained territory, but that was not legal. So the international community never really accepted or recognized Jordan's control of the land. So to say that Israel is occupying Jordan's land is inaccurate. Even back in the 80s, Jordan renounced all claims to the land. It was never really theirs to begin with. So if it wasn't Jordan's, then whose land was it? Well, before Jordan had control, it was designated by the United Nations to be, parts of it were designated to be part of the new Arab state in the region, and parts of it were designated to be part of Israel. But that never happened. The Arabs rejected that plan. Before that, it was part of the British Mandate, which doesn't exist anymore. Before that, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, which doesn't exist anymore. And we can go back, and none of the empires that controlled the land exist anymore. So to say that Israel is occupying another sovereign nation's territory is simply inaccurate, because there is no sovereign nation whose territory, who the territory belongs to. So then why is it disputed? Why isn't it just Israel? Why is there any dispute at all if it's not occupied? So there's a concept. The reason it's disputed is because, well, whose was it? It never really belonged to anyone after the British Mandate left. So there's a concept in customary international law. It's a Latin phrase that I'm definitely going to mispronounce, but it's something like uti possidetis juris. And basically, I'm not a scholar of international law, but I learn a lot about it. I find it really interesting and really relevant. And basically, this concept means that when a territory that was colonized, it was part of a larger empire that had been colonized, gains independence. So when a territory that had been part of a colony becomes an independent country, the borders of that new independent country remain the same as the borders of whatever the colonized region was, unless there's some other agreement that is signed, that is made. So what does that mean in our context? We had the British Mandate. The British Mandate included the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. It included Gaza. It included all of the kind of what we think of as like that map of Israel. And when Israel gained independence, according to this principle in international law, it means that Israel was basically should have had the exact same borders as the British Mandate. Now, the British Mandate did include Jordan as well, but that had been changed because there was an agreement made for Jordan to become an independent country. So the rest of it should have become Israel. If the Arabs had accepted the UN partition plan, both sides had accepted it, then that would have changed things. That would have been an agreement that changed the borders, but that didn't happen. So according to this principle, the land was actually Israel's all along. So Israel can't be occupying, it's occupying itself then. Like that means Jordan was actually occupying Israel's territory. So again, that means that it should just be Israel. Why is it disputed? So there are those who think that this concept shouldn't apply anymore for different reasons, either because while Israel technically should have included all of that land to begin with, it didn't. When Israel declared independence, they were declaring it only in the parts that had been given to them based on the partition plan. Others say because things have changed so much since then, 1948 was a long time ago, we can't really be using this principle anymore. So there are different kind of understandings, but basically it's not totally clear cut that that principle applies today. So even though it might not be, it's definitely not occupied because it's no one else's land. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's Israel's land either. So that's why we use the term disputed, as it's sort of the most accurate term. The next question, people often call it not only occupied territories, but illegally occupied territories, or Israel's illegal occupation. So the question is, what law are they talking about? So there is no law that Israel's breaking and having control of this land. Again, sometimes people will say, well, Israel gained control in an offensive war because they don't know. They think, well, Israel started the 6-Day War because they attacked Egypt. And what they don't realize is that Egypt blocking the access to the Suez Canal, that actually did start the war. So some people might think it's illegal because they think that Israel was the one to start the war. Others just kind of repeat the phrase because it sounds good, it helps their cause. But if you actually ask them what law they're talking about, they typically don't know. So it's definitely not illegal for Israel to have control over that region. Again, at most, it's ambiguous, right? At most, it's disputed. Because what we do know, though, is that of any nation, Israel has the strongest claim to that land. It might not be a rock solid claim, but it's definitely a stronger claim than Jordan has, because Jordan never had control of the land. There was never an independent Palestinian state in the region. So illegal is definitely not an appropriate term to use. So I hope that clarified some terminology. So now to go back to what happened after the 67 war, after the 6-Day War. So we said that Israel had expressed a willingness to negotiate peace agreements with Syria and with Egypt in exchange for giving back the land that they had gained. This did not apply to Jordan because, again, Jordan never had the rights to the West Bank or Judea and Samaria anyway, so there was no reason for Israel to give that land back, but they were willing to give back the Golan Heights to Syria and the Sinai Desert to Egypt. But the Arab world does not respond. Instead, a few months later, they hold the Khartoum Conference, which was a meeting of 8 Arab heads of state in Khartoum, and they came up with this policy, which says the occupied lands are Arab lands, and the burden of regaining these lands falls on all the Arab states. they issued what's known as the 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. An insistence on the rights of Palestinian people in their own country. So, this last part, we already said there never was a Palestinian country here. It was always a province of a larger empire. But really what's significant are the 3 no's, because these basically close the door on any possibility of progress towards peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors, right? They say flat out, there's no peace. They're not willing to recognize Israel, and they're not willing to negotiate. So it didn't really leave Israel with much choice in terms of, next steps. Shortly afterwards, the United Nations Security Council adopts Resolution 242. It says that they affirm the fulfillment of the Charter principles, and it requires the establishment of a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, and it should include the 2 following principles. So the first principle is that withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. So it's significant that it does not say all territories. It doesn't specify which ones. It leaves room. It's open-ended, and it leaves room for negotiations. And the second principle is the termination of all claims or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area, and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries free from threats or acts of force. So that means that there's no indication of which one has to come first, which one precedes the other one. It's just 2 principles. So people will say, oh, according to Resolution 242, Israel has to give back the land. But no, Israel doesn't have to give back the land unless there is also a termination of all states of belligerency and acknowledgement of the sovereignty. But as we saw previously, the Arab League in the Khartoum conference already rejected this before they even saw it, because they were not willing to make peace or acknowledge Israel's right to exist. And so this didn't really, Israel accepted this in theory, but it didn't really help with anything because they didn't have anyone that was willing to negotiate. This changed later on when Egypt was open to it. Israel did follow through on Resolution 242. They returned the Sinai Desert in exchange for a peace agreement with Egypt. And eventually in the 90s, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, agreed to use this as a basis for peace negotiations, but it took a very long time. So what happened? What was the reality in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, and in Gaza, actually, after 1967? What did it look like? What did life look like? So Israel sets up what's called a military occupation. This is different than a territorial occupation, which we already said did not exist because no sovereign nation's territory was being occupied. But there is what's called a military occupation. And that basically means that the people living there who are not Israeli citizens, so the Palestinians, they are living under the control of a military administration who they don't vote for. So all of the people living there are now under the control of the Israeli government, the Israeli military, and they governed the entire West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and Gaza until the Oslo Accords, which came in 93, 95. And while Israel was in control of this region, they had 2 basic responsibilities. The first was the infrastructure and civil administration of the Palestinians living there. So providing them with roads, healthcare, schools, all of those kinds of needs. And the second was to protect Israelis. A lot of terrorism had been coming out of this region, and now that Israel had control over it, they were able to get that under control. It led to major increases in the quality of life for the people living here. Things like literacy rates and life expectancy rose significantly. Infant mortality fell. But on the other hand, Israel also enacted measures to control the security situation, counterterrorism measures that were really a top priority for Israel that also made life a lot more difficult for Palestinians on the other hand. So they kind of had to balance and juggle these two needs. And I think, they still are today. The main thing to realize is this was meant to be temporary. When Israel gained control of this territory, Israel did not plan to maintain control over it in this fashion, in this military occupation for the next, until today, really. It was meant to be just a temporary thing while they worked out some sort of peace negotiations that would lead to a more permanent resolution. However, of course, that requires a partner on the other side who's also willing to, to make that happen. So we'll see where that went. But before that, just a quick note on Israeli settlements. This is something we hear about a lot. Israeli settlements basically means Israeli communities that are in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. There used to be also settlements in Gaza and the Sinai Desert, but those have been dismantled. So in 1967, Israel had a labor government, a left-wing government, and they began building Jewish settlements in the land that they had just gained from Jordan. They built them strategically, so to help with defensive purposes, and they built around 40 settlements in the time that the Labor government was in control. Again, for strategic purposes, they built them in areas that would help them with defense if Jordan were to attack again, and in areas that helped them kind of monitor what was going on. And they were mainly built away from Arab villages. When the right-wing government came into power in Israel, they started building settlements more for ideological reasons than for strategic reasons, and they didn't really stay as much away from the Arab villages. So this was viewed as a problem by the Arab residents who saw it as stolen land. And the international community does call these illegal settlements. And they hold that they are illegal because of the Geneva Convention, which we see down here, which was established in response to Hitler, who would conquer different territory in Europe and then deport German citizens to live in those newly acquired territories in order to Germanize them. So the international community established the Geneva Convention. It says the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. So the first thing to note is that, as we said, Israel is not an occupying power in the sense that it's not occupying the territory. The people is a different story, but it's not occupying the territory. So already this doesn't really make sense when we're applying it to Israel, but it gets even weirder when we look at what it's actually saying. So Israel shouldn't deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory occupied. So this was created to protect civilians from being forcibly moved around by their government. So if we apply this to Israel, it's saying that Israel cannot forcibly transfer Israelis to the West Bank, to Judea and Samaria, and force them to live there, which we know is not what's happening. People living there are choosing to live there for their own reasons. So this does not, can't really be applied to Israel. So when people talk about, illegal settlements, it's important to ask them, like, what law do you think, what's illegal about it? And then to explain to them, well, actually, this does not fit. So the UN definitely considers them to be illegal. The Security Council Resolution 2334 calls it occupied Palestinian territory. It says the settlements are a flagrant violation under international law. Very strong wording. It's definitely not a flagrant violation if this is the international law that they're talking about. So something that I think is just significant is that often the settlements are painted as the reason for the conflict. People say, well, Israel clearly doesn't want peace because of the settlements. I think this is really important to kind of push back on for several reasons. First of all, the conflict existed before the settlements existed. So to blame them for a conflict that started before 1967 it's just not honest. The conflict existed way before that. As well, Jewish settlements make up, I think it's something like 3 to 5% of the territory in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. So, to blame that on the entire lack of peace is just, again, not being honest. So in 1993 and then again in 1995, the Israeli Prime Minister Rabin and head of the Palestine Liberation Organization, later the Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat, met to sit down for the first time to try and negotiate some sort of peace agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And essentially what came out of it was that Israel would, for the next 5 years, withdraw from certain areas of the West Bank of Judea and Samaria in order to grant self-governance to the Palestinians. And this was supposed to be a 5-year kind of first step to potentially then negotiating a more permanent, lasting solution and a more kind of official Palestinian state. They drew up a map, it looks like this, based on where people were living at the time. So no one had to move as a result of it. So anywhere where Jews were living, where there were Jewish settlements, that was under Israeli control. That was Area C, the light kind of purple area. Anywhere that had the major Palestinian urban centers, the big cities, that became Area A, that's the brown, and that came under full Palestinian control. So in Area A, there was no Israeli presence or control whatsoever. Area B was sort of the border areas, that's the light yellow, and that was under joint control. And this, again, the idea was this was supposed to be a 5-year kind of interim solution to see how things would go. And then in 5 years, they would meet again to figure out what to do on a more permanent level. And it's important, I think, to realize that there are some Palestinians who are living in Area C who live under, again, that they're still under the Israeli military occupation. And as we'll see, that remains to be the case today. And people often blame Israel for this situation, but I think it's important to remember that Yasser Arafat agreed to this deal. So it was an it wasn't something that was imposed by Israel. Israel and the Palestinian leadership agreed to this map and to this system. So, they were placed into this situation basically through this agreement. It wasn't something that Israel just imposed kind of unilaterally. And again, this was meant to be a 5-year plan. After 5 years, in 2000, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak meets with Yasser Arafat, and they go back and forth with different offers. Finally, Israel offers a state in 97% of the West Bank or Judea and Samaria with 3% land swap, so some land inside of Israel in exchange for areas where there were settlements, as well as in 100% of the Gaza Strip. This would be an independent Palestinian state, and they would receive billions of dollars to resettle Palestinian refugees in that state. They would have a shared capital in Jerusalem, but they would require an end to all fighting and an end to any more claims on the Palestinian part of more land. Yasser Arafat refuses to accept this plan. He didn't make any counteroffer. He accepted it. He just rejected the plan, and basically launches the second intifada right after that, which we'll get to on the next slide. But after, in 2008, there's another offer. This was sort of the last formal peace offer, official peace offer that has been made by Israel to the Palestinian leadership. Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert calls Mahmoud Abbas, who was by this time the head of the Palestinian Authority. He offers him a state in the equivalent of 100% of the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. That would include 6% land swaps. Some settlements would be evacuated, others would be annexed by Israel or become officially part of Israel. Annex isn't really the right term. They would have a shared capital in Jerusalem. Abbas doesn't even respond to this offer officially. The only reason we know that he received it is because of this map that he drew while on the phone call, where he sort of maps out what the region would look like, and it's on the official PLO paper, stationery. So I'm not going to go too much into this. I think most people know what happened during the Second Intifada, but this basically was launched right after the failed peace talks in 2000. The Palestinian leadership kind of instigated this uprising with, hundreds of Israelis being killed every year for a period of about 5 years. Really, really horrible period, difficult period for Israel. And the Israeli leadership realized that the vast majority of the attacks were coming in from Area A, from that area that was supposed to be under full Palestinian control. And part of the Oslo Accord agreement was that the Palestinian Authority was supposed to be putting a stop to Palestinian terror and controlling it, but really they were instigating it. They had their own forces that were fighting in the Second Intifada. So Israel sort of eventually realized after 5 years of this that or in the middle of the 5-year period, that if the Palestinian Authority is not upholding their promise to put a stop to terror, then Israel doesn't have to uphold their promise to stay out of Area A. So they go back in, they launch an operation to weed out the terrorism, destroy the weapons, all of that. They also construct the security barrier, which again gets a lot of inaccurate attention in the media. This is what's often referred to as the wall, the apartheid wall, the ghetto wall, things like that. And what is important to realize is, first of all, this was only built as a result of the Second Intifada. So when people say that Israel has a policy of restricting the Palestinian movement, while that's true right now, it's very important, I think, to realize that it's not that Israel took control of the territory in 1967 and immediately decided, okay, we need to block these people into a certain area. Not at all. Only in the early 2000s, when there was all of this out of control terrorism coming in, did Israel decide to build this barrier. So it was a result of the terrorism. It was not, something that Israel wanted to do initially. And this basically allowed Israel to control who was coming in and out of Israel proper from the Palestinian territories. So they set up checkpoints. 95% of it is a fence like this. Only about 5% of it is the concrete walls that we always see, in the news or that we hear about. And the wall is just where it's needed for strategic purposes if there are Israeli communities living really close to it, or roads. And the construction of this barrier led to a 90% decrease in terror attacks, in addition to the whole operation of rooting out the terrorism. So, when people call for the wall to be dismantled, I think it's really important to point out to them that what they're really saying is that they would be okay with going back to a situation where 400 or 500 Israeli civilians, non-Jewish and Jewish alike, are being murdered by terrorists. That's really the purpose of this security barrier. Again, that's not to say that it didn't make life incredibly inconvenient for the innocent Palestinians who are living in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, and who now, their businesses are harmed, their views are harmed, their mobility is harmed. So, it's not to say that it didn't cause any problems, but again, Israel always has to balance not making things more difficult for the Palestinians, while innocent, Palestinian civilians, while also needing to keep Israelis safe as well. I'm sure people are familiar with this. I'm not going to go too much into it, but basically in 2005, after there wasn't really any progression in the peace process, Israel decides to pull out of the Gaza Strip unilaterally. So this is not done as a result of any sort of negotiations or agreements with the Palestinian leadership. Israel just does this in an attempt to improve their security situation, to improve their international relations. And very soon after this, Hamas ends up taking over, and we know the amount of terrorism and rocket fire that's been coming out of the Gaza Strip ever since. So what are some recent developments since the Oslo Accords, since the disengagement from Gaza? What's kind of been going on in the past decade? So Israeli settlements have continued to expand and grow in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. They're not building new settlements in the past decade. That's something, again, that the media often gets wrong, is they'll say that Israel is building new settlements, when in fact what they're doing is building new houses in existing settlements. So just, there's population growth, so they're building more housing. I remember seeing an article that said Israel was building something like 120 new settlements, when it meant 120 new housing units in one, I think it was in Efrat. Like, I don't know if they know how big Israel is, that they think that, they can just build 120 new settlements, but that's the idea. The settlement policy in Israel depends a lot on the United States president and their views on it. So when Obama was president, it was much slower, the settlement building. When Trump was president, it increased. According to the Israeli Supreme Court, settlements are legal, as long as they have the right zoning. If they don't, they're destroyed. Then they're called outposts. And right now, when it comes to the West Bank, to Judea and Samaria, and areas A and B, Israel's presence is deemed necessary. It's their responsibility, while they are there and while they retain the right to go into Palestinian villages and homes and refugee camps, to make it as little of an inconvenience as possible to the innocent Palestinians, while also doing their job to protect innocent Israelis and to stop terror attacks. So right now, Israel does have a presence in those areas, or at least they go in when necessary. There is more cooperation with, or at least coordination with, the Palestinian Authority since Hamas's takeover of Gaza, because Israel and the Palestinian Authority now have the shared interest of not allowing Hamas or other similar groups to take control in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. And because of that, Israel doesn't have to be as present, but they definitely still do maintain that presence. When it comes to Hamas, we know there are still regular conflicts every few years, unfortunately. So those are some of the recent developments. And just to kind of wrap up, and then we'll open it up if there are questions, but where are things heading from here? Where do we see things going? So there are many different ideas in terms of, what can Israel do to, or what can Israel and the Palestinians, what kind of resolution can they come to? 1 state, 2 states, confederates, 8 states. Like, there are many different ideas out there and many different opinions. But I think the bottom line is that no solution can work at this point. There needs to be major cultural change and a change in the education that exists in the region in order for there to be any possibility of moving forward. Right now, the Palestinian Authority educates their population for violence. They incite, there's a couple of excellent organizations that you can look into. One of them is called Palestinian Media Watch, and they basically monitor the official Palestinian Authority media to see what kinds of messages are coming out of there. And it's very, very concerning to see what's going on, the amount of incitement and hatred towards Jewish people and Israel. There's another organization called Impact SE, and they monitor the textbooks of all around the Middle East, including the Palestinian Authority. And really what we see from there is that there's an entire generation of children growing up being taught to hate, being taught to martyr themselves. And so, until that changes, there's not really any possibility that a child growing up in that environment is going to be able or willing to make peace when they think that we are literally embodiment of the devil. On the Israeli side, as a result of this, Israelis are becoming less open as well and more willing to just live with the status quo. A lot of people in Israel are no longer on the left, no longer in kind of the peace camp. The parties that used to be really big in that are now very small in the Knesset. So Israelis kind of feel like, well, if the other side's not willing to work with us, then, what are we supposed to do? And they're sort of giving up. So there really needs to be major cultural changes that we see before any solution can really be possible. So I think with that, we'll wrap up. Maybe I'll stop sharing.